Second Kings chapter 1 is the source for our Bible study tonight. And once again, I'd like to encourage you, if you haven't already, just stop the video and take some time to read that chapter and print the questions off beforehand and then go over them go over them with us as we go through the lesson tonight. And certainly that's beneficial, will help you a lot. If you don't do that, I'd encourage you to go ahead and start doing that. But our starter question tonight begins question number 1. It says, why do you think that there is a popular association between being struck by lightning and being judged by God? Well, tonight, as we're going to read in our story, there were a group of people, actually 2 different groups of people, who were struck by lightning, and that lightning strike was indeed the judgment of God. So why do we think that people often associate lightning strike with the judgment of God? Well, first of all, I would say because you read about stories like this in the Bible, where lightning strikes at certain times were indeed the judgment of God. The second thing that's kind of interesting about this question is it's man's philosophy and his theology concerning the belief in gods. And certainly when you study Greek mythology, of course, the king of the gods was Zeus, who was the god of lightning. And it's just interesting that mankind often has associated, lightning with the use of gods. And so it would just make common sense that if that's the way that humans have thought over the years, that certainly today that might be part of the process also. And then, of course, you also have the idea in the Bible that God does use natural events and natural disasters from time to time to punish nations or people. And you read in the Old Testament, you know how God used the sword. He used wars. He used droughts, famines to punish people and nations. Pestilence, you have locusts, you have frogs, you have things like that. And certainly God used them in the past to bring people and nations into judgment. And I think he continues to do that today, although it's hard today to put your finger on any certain natural disaster and say for sure, yes, this is the judgment of God upon someone or upon some nation. But certainly the Bible does teach that he did that in the past. And so because he used those natural disasters and physical attributes of this world to punish, people often associate, the lightning strike again with the act or the judgment of God today. Well, we're going to read about that and a lot of other stuff in our study tonight. And so I encourage you to go over with me to 2 Kings chapter 1. Now, as you're making your way over there, just to kind of point out a fact, there's really no division between 1 Kings and 2 Kings. I know there's a division in our English Bible, but actually in the Hebrew Bible, they were one continuous book. And you see the link between the two. We ended last week studying or reading about the brief reign of Ahaziah, just kind of summation or summary of his reign. And then immediately in chapter 1 here in the book of 2 Kings, we pick up with the same story, reading about some more details about the reign of Ahaziah. So it's not really a new subject. We're just transitioning into the English division of the book of 2 Kings. But the first chapter of 2 Kings is really a continuation of the last chapter of the book of 1 Kings. And so let's go to verse 1 and read verses 1 through 8, and then we'll go over some of the questions. In verse 1 it says, Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab. Now Ahaziah fell through the lattice of his upper room in Samaria and was injured. So he sent messengers and said to them, Go inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover from this injury. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, Arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say to them, Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Now therefore, thus says the Lord, You shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die. So Elijah departed. And when the messengers returned to him, he said to them, Why have you come back? So they said to him, A man came up here to meet us and said to us, Go return to the king who sent you and say to him, Thus says the Lord, Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are sending to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die. Then he said to them, What kind of man was it who came up to meet you and told you these words? So they answered him, a hairy man wearing a leather belt around his waist. And he said, it is Elijah the Tishbite. The very first verse here in this chapter, we read about how Moab rebels against Israel after the death of Ahab. Moab had been put under taxes. They'd been put subject to the kingdom of Israel. And whenever they heard about the death of Ahab, then they thought, well, this is probably a good time for us to rebel or get out under the hand of Israel. Obviously, when there's a change in political power, a lot of people see that as an opportunity to take advantage of that change. And so Moab was no different than that. The second thing that we read about is an unfortunate incident that happened to Ahaziah. He falls from his upper room, probably the top of his roof. We've talked before about how the design of that day and age was to have a flat roof, and this was kind of like a getaway for the people, kind of like a porch would be, a front porch might be for us, or a garden setting or something like that. But in the cool of the evening, they would go up, they would relax, they'd walk on top of their houses, and evidently there's some railing around the top of that house that either wasn't sturdy or was big enough that a person could fall through it. And Ahaziah took a tumble from that and became very seriously injured because of it. And he wanted to know what would happen to him. And so question number 2 is, why do we have such a strong desire to know what will happen to us in advance? Ahaziah did what most of us would do in a very serious situation. Now, I want to emphasize that he knew his injuries were very severe. And that's indicated by the fact that he asked, is he going to survive this or not? Is he going to recover from this or not? The second thing is, Ahaziah isn't physically able to make this journey and this trip to ask this question, and so he sends his servants in his place. And so what do you do in a time like that? Well, he did what anybody in that situation would do. He seeks help from his or her God. Unfortunately, he didn't worship the God of Israel. He didn't worship the one and true God, but he worshiped Baal like his parents did, and we'll talk some more about that too. But think about uncertainty. I think nobody likes uncertainty in their life. If all of us were given the choice of whether we could know when we would die or not know, I think all of us would choose we want to know. We don't like uncertainty. And certainly when you think about the difference between life and death, that's a major transition. And if we could know when we were going to die, then there's some steps that we're going to take, and there's probably some things that we're going to put in order, some people that we're going to talk to. And so if Ahaziah could know that for sure, then I think there were some steps that he wanted to take in order to prepare himself to depart from this world. And so none of us like uncertainty, but unfortunately that comes with death. None of us know the time of our death, but we certainly do know from the teachings of the Bible that we will pass from this life one day. Question number 3 is, what might have motivated the king of Israel to consult one of the gods of Ekron when he wanted to know the future? Well, that's what Ahaziah did. He didn't go to consult God and ask him, am I going to recover from this injury or not? But he sought an answer from the gods of Ekron. And what motivated him to do that? Well, I would say his mother and his father's influence. We've read and we've studied about how Ahab and Jezebel, Ahab was Ahaziah's father, Jezebel was his mother, and they were truly wicked people. Well, what kind of child would you expect these tremendously wicked father and tremendously wicked mother to raise? Well, we would expect the child to be as equally wicked as they were. And that's just exactly how Ahaziah turned out. And so what caused him to seek an answer from this false god? Well, it was ultimately, I think it was the influence of his father and his mother. And so he was really just following in the footsteps of his parents. Question number 4, what should Ahaziah have concluded about God because God's prophet intercepted his messengers? Well, we read about how in the midst of Ahaziah sending these messengers to a false god, that God sends Elijah to these messengers and tells him that he's going to die. He's not going to recover from this injury. And he asked him the question, why did you go to seek an answer to Baal-zebub when you could have got the answer right here from the one and true living God? So what should Ahaziah have concluded because Elijah was sent to intercept these people? Well, Elijah had no way of knowing that these men were going to Ekron or that they were going to inquire about the life of the king. So it should have told Ahaziah that Jehovah, Elijah being the prophet of Jehovah God, that Jehovah God was the one and true living God. And certainly he held the power of life and of death within his hand. And so he is the one to whom Ahaziah should have turned and sought answers, and God alone could have healed him of undoubtedly of this injury that he had suffered. Question number 5 is, what did Ahaziah know immediately when he heard the description of the man who sent him the message? Well, these men come back to him and they say that a prophet, told us that intercepted us on the way and told us to come back and to deliver this message to you. And so Ahaziah, whenever they return, he was asking, why are you back so soon? How is it that you've made this trip so quickly? And obviously they didn't make the trip because it got interrupted. But the question was, how did Ahaziah know immediately? Whenever they talked about this prophet, Ahaziah said, well, what did he look like? And his servants gave him this description, and immediately he knows that it's Elijah the Tishbite. And so the question is, how would he know that? Well, I have an idea that Ahaziah was very familiar with Elijah. Growing up with your parents being Ahab and Jezebel, Elijah made appearances before them time to time, and Ahaziah being raised in that royal court, there's probably no doubt that he had seen Elijah himself and probably even heard some of the prophecies and condemnation that were pronounced by the lips of Elijah himself toward Ahab and toward Jezebel. And so he knew about Elijah, and he knew about his physical appearance. Question number 6 is, for what positive spiritual trait can you aspire to become notorious? Now, this is based upon this idea that Elijah was known by certain physical traits. We read in the passage how when Ahaziah asked his servants, what did this man look like? They said, well, he was a hairy man, and he had a leather belt that he wore around his waist. And those two physical descriptions alone were enough for Ahaziah to immediately recognize this is nobody else but Elijah the Tishbite. And so there were some physical traits or characteristics that caused him to be known and distinguished from everybody else. And we as Christians, there's certain traits that we should have, spiritually speaking, by which men can identify us, which cause us to stand out from everybody else. And the question is, what trait can you aspire to, spiritual trait can you aspire to become notorious for? And the answer is really whatever we want. When you think about some of the great characters of the Bible, they're known for certain things. When we think about Abraham, for instance, he's notorious for being a man of faith. When we think about Moses, Numbers 12:3 tells us that he was a very meek man. In fact, he was the meekest man on the face of the earth. And so Moses was notorious for his meekness. When you think about or hear the name Job, in James 5:11, it says we know the story of Job and how he's a picture of patience or endurance. And so there's certain spiritual traits that these men were known for, they became notorious for. And as Christians, we should try to develop certain traits within our lives by which we can be known and identified too, just like Elijah had those physical traits. All right, let's go back to our passage here in 2 Kings chapter 1, and we're going to begin reading in verse 9. It says, Then the king sent to him a captain of 50 with his 50 men. So he went up to him, and there he was, sitting on the top of a hill. And he spoke to him, Man of God, the king has said, Come down. So Elijah answered and said to the captain of 50, If I am a man of God, then let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men. And fire came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. Then he sent to him another captain of 50 with his 50 men. And he answered and said to him, Man of God, thus has the king said, Come down quickly. So Elijah answered and said to them, If I am a man of God, Let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men. And the fire of God came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. Again he sent to him a third captain, and again he sent to him a third captain of 50 with his 50 men. And the third captain of 50 went up and came and fell on his knees before Elijah and pleaded with him and said to him, Man of God, please let my life and the life of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight. Look, fire has come down from heaven and burned up the first two captains of 50s with their 50s. But let now my life be precious in your sight. And the angel of the Lord said to Elijah, Go down with him, do not be afraid of him. So he arose and went down with him to the king. Question number 7 is, what was Elijah's dramatic answer to the captain who came to capture him? Well, again, Ahaziah, after he identifies this prophet, he immediately sends out a captain with 50 soldiers to go and to arrest Elijah and to bring him back before him. But the answer was, when this captain goes out with these 50 men and he sees here's Elijah sitting on top of a mountain, and he says, Man of God, and I don't think he was using that term in a complimentary way. It was supposed to be, I think, more of a derogatory term. But here you are, you're a man of God, you're a prophet of God. Now you, prophet of God, man of God, you got to stand before the king. King orders you to come down from that mountain. And so his answer was, if he was truly a prophet of God, then fire was going to come down from heaven and devour all these men. And I think what he was calling upon was, he was calling upon God to come to his defense, to testify to the fact that he was indeed a prophet of God and to protect him. And it brings up an interesting thought about Elijah. Again, when we think about Elijah, we often set him in a category way up here, and then, this is us way down here. But James 5 and verse 17 says that Elijah was just a man. And it was just a man who prayed to God for it not to rain, and for the space of 3.5 years it did not rain. And here he is again. It was just a man. He was just a man, but he was calling for fire to come down from heaven. And so it kind of, I think, again, encourages me as a Christian to be more bold in my approach before God. Now, I know the days of miracles are over. I don't think any of you would believe that I've fallen off the bandwagon on that, but it is the case that when we go before God, we need to be very bold in the things that we ask. And whenever we ask, we need to ask great things of God. I mean, Elijah asked for it not to rain for 3.5 years, and it didn't rain. Elijah asked for fire to come down from heaven, and fire came down from heaven. And so I think a lot of times in our approach to God, we're not as bold as we should be. We probably don't ask for great of things as we should ask for. Now, again, don't think I'm saying ask for a miracle, because the Bible says don't do that. That's not in keeping with the will of God. But there's certainly great things that we can ask for and pray for, and God has the ability to answer such prayers. Question number 8 is, what conclusion should Ahaziah have drawn from the disappearance of the first captain? Well, the fact that Ahaziah sends 50 men to arrest Elijah shows that he had great contempt for Elijah. And he considered him a criminal. But when you send 50 men out to arrest one man and they don't come back, you have to believe in your mind that something is terribly wrong. And so I think Ahaziah should have said, wait a minute, I've sent the 50 men after one, and one man was able to overcome these 50 men. There might be a little more something to this. I might want to reconsider about who Elijah is and the prophet that he is and the God that he serves. But of course, Ahaziah was just like his parents, Ahab and Jezebel. There was nothing that could be done or said that was ever going to change his mind. Question number 9 is, with what attitude did the third captain approach Elijah? We read about how Ahaziah sends, after the first 50 men, he sends another 50. They meet the same fate. And then the third captain that comes with the 50 soldiers, he comes in a different attitude. All these other men came with arrogance and pride, but this man comes with tremendous humility. And so he bows before Elijah. He falls down to his knees and he pleads for his life and for the life of his men. And the attitude that he showed, of course, was an attitude of humility. And the Bible teaches us that God despises, hates arrogance and pride, but he has respect for the act of humility and toward those who exhibit it. And so we have passages in the Bible like James 4 and verse 6 that talks about how we should humble ourselves. God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And then in verse 10 of the same book and chapter, he says that God will exalt those who humble themselves. So if we humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord, he will lift us up. So this man fell to his knees. He was showing humility. And what did God do? God respected that. And so God didn't send fire down from heaven to devour him and his men. But he in fact told Elijah to go with him. And number 10 says, why would Elijah be hesitant to go back to the king with the captains and their armed men? You might read in the story and say, well, there's nothing that says he was hesitant, but remember what God told him. He said, do not be afraid. Well, why would God tell him that? Because he was afraid. Do not be afraid. Why would he be hesitant? Because from a physical standpoint, that seems foolish, doesn't it? I would rather sit on that mountaintop and let God take care of all these men who've come to arrest me than to go back willingly in the hands of these soldiers and to the king himself and to stand before him. But that's exactly what Elijah did because God told him to do it. And obviously Ahaziah had tremendous hatred toward Elijah. He had it in for him. He had animosity toward him. And so it would have been a dangerous situation, physically speaking, for Elijah to go back with him. Question number 11 is, although we sometimes find ourselves alone as believers, in what sense are we not necessarily at the mercy of our enemies? There are two things that really stand out to me about this story that we're reading about. And again, Elijah was just one man, and it seems like he's at the mercy of the king here when these 50 men to come out, but that was actually not the reality of the situation. And the reason why is, number one, because God's in control. No matter what happens in this universe, God is still the ruler of this world. And so no matter what king is appointed, no matter what authority may try to do to us, what the laws of men or the powers of men may try to do toward us, you still have to remember that God is in control. And if God is in control, then God can help. And certainly, that's the blessings that we have as Christians, not that we're out here worshiping a false God that doesn't exist and can't help us and can't influence the universe or change or alter the course of events. That's not the God that we're serving. We're serving the God that is in control. And so we're never really at the mercy of our enemies because God is always in control of this world. The second thing is that God cares. 1 Peter 5:7 tells us to throw all of our cares upon him because he cares for us. And so no matter what situation we're in life, no matter what trials we might be facing, God cares. No matter what temptations we have to go through, God cares about those things. No matter what hardships we might have to endure, no matter what misfortunes might come our way, God cares. And so those two things should encourage us as Christians that we're never really at the mercy of anybody. God is always in control and God always cares regardless of what situation we're facing. Let's go down to verse 16 and finish up the chapter then. Then he said to him, thus says the Lord, because you have sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, is it because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word? Therefore you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die. So Ahaziah died according to the word of the Lord, which Elijah had spoken. Because he had no son, Jehoram became king in his place, in the 2nd year of Jehoram the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. Now the rest of the acts of Ahaziah which he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Question number 12 is, what message did Elijah personally deliver to the king? Well, the message was that he would never get out of his bed again. He was going to die. And so he would never recover from that severe injury that he received. Question 13, what became of Ahaziah, king of Israel? Well, what happened to him was just what Elijah prophesied would happen to him. He ultimately died. But it is interesting to note that the scriptures make note of he had no son. And so there was nobody in his lineage to reign in his stead. So what happened is Jehoram, his brother, became the successor to the throne. And so he lost his claim to the throne, and he had a very brief reign, or only a reign of 2 years that he enjoyed there as king of Israel. Question number 14, what action of Ahaziah clearly aroused the Lord's anger and led to the Lord's judgment on him? And of course, the answer is turning away from the Lord. He, instead of trying to find an answer to a question from God, which would have been the truth, he turned to a figment of his imagination. He turned to an idol that didn't exist, to a God that didn't exist, that couldn't help him, that couldn't heal him, that couldn't give him an answer to his question. And so ultimately he died because he turned away from God. He turned to a figment of his imagination instead of turning to the truth. You know, there's again a great application in there for us, because God has laid the truth out before us. And if we don't love that truth, and we don't hold on to it, and we don't turn to it to find the answers, but instead we just turn to our own imagination, and we want to believe and think, well, things aren't really going to be like God says they are, then what's going to happen to us in the end? Well, we're going to perish, because we've thrown away any chance that we have of healing or recovering from sin, because we've turned away from Jehovah God. And the whole thing about Ahaziah is, you know, he knew better. He knew better from personal experience. He knew better from Elijah intercepting his prophets. He knew better after he sent his soldiers out and they got struck dead by lightning. He knew better because of the experiences of his mother and his father, Ahab and Jezebel. And so the bottom line was he knew better, but he went ahead and he did it anyway. And he refused to repent, and because of that, God punished him for it. Well, I hope you benefited from the study tonight. Lord willing, next week we'll all be back together again. And you can study 2 Kings chapter 2. We're going to talk about and study about how Elisha takes over the office of Elijah. Until then, you know, stay safe and healthy, and just pray that God would bless all of us as we study His Word.